Hey there, I'm Josh, and welcome back to The Lord of the Rings, Artifacts of Arda. In the last episode, I focused on the moment in the film when Frodo was pierced by the cursed Morgul blade on Weathertop. In the following scenes, we learned just how dire the situation is. Frodo is severely ill and beyond Strider's skill to heal. The best he can hope to do is slow down the poisonous effects. Luckily, a mysterious elf arrives. After searching for the small party, Arwen, the daughter of Elrond. She takes Frodo and together they set off at a blistering pace across the countryside to get to her people, narrowly and frantically escaping the tireless chase of the Nazgul along the way. After Arwen uses a bit of elf magic to fend off their pursuers, Frodo seemingly starts to give in to the poisonous curse. In a desperate attempt to further sustain him, Arwen selflessly passes on some of her immortality. Frodo awakens in the house of Elrond, brought back from the Vale but still on the mend. And Gandalf is there as well. He recounts to Frodo the details of his delay, being betrayed by Saruman and imprisoned atop Orthanc. After making a daring escape on the back of a mighty eagle, he rejoins his friends at Rivendell. Frodo meets up with his fellow hobbits, when in the distance he once again sees his uncle Bilbo. The two get to embrace and catch up with one another, with Bilbo revealing that he finally got to finish his book. There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Tale by Bilbo Baggins. Frodo meets up with Sam and they discuss their intention to return home to the Shire, leaving the ring in Rivendell. Except at the same time, Gandalf and Elrond are discussing what to do with the ring. Elrond explains that it cannot stay here. Just then, some other visitors start to arrive for a council meeting on how to handle the ring. And it is here that we see Boromir and his iconic shield. Wait, what the... Where is it? Where's the detail shot of the shield? I swear I remember seeing the full view of Boromir's shield as he rides into Rivendell. That's why I based this episode on his shield. Well, crap. This is embarrassing. Apparently we don't really get to see it until later on. Note to self. Your memory is failing you. Next time, review the movie footage before deciding on and almost finishing the project. That way you won't look like as much of a moron. Anyway, yeah. This episode is all about making Boromir's shield. Something I'd be making at some point anyway, just not yet, apparently. Oh well, let's get started. For the main body of this shield, I'm using a piece of 3/4 inch thick MDF for the front, and a piece of 1/2 inch thick plywood for the back. The main reason I didn't use MDF the whole way through is just because I didn't want the shield to be ridiculously heavy. After I got both pieces cut down to size, I found the center by using a straight edge and going from corner to corner and drawing an X in the middle. I used a spring-driven punch to mark the center holes on each piece and then drilled them out. Next, I set up my Fisher's Shop circle cutting jig to cut the square blanks down into, you guessed it, circles. This is probably the 5th or 6th time that I've used this jig, and it works perfectly every time. If you're interested in making one yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below to the video showing you how to do it, and a link to the plans as well. Once the circles were both cut down to shape, I slathered on a generous amount of wood glue onto the bottom piece, and used a piece of scrap to spread it around, like a spatula. It kind of resembles the beginnings of a really disgusting looking pizza. Although this pizza might be great for weight loss, because if you eat it, you die. Anyway, I repeated the same process with this delicious looking piece of MDF, and then I sandwiched them together, like a big gross looking Oreo. Why do I keep talking about food? I must be hungry. Moving on, I'm using a tool here that I haven't really used in a video yet. It's a lathe, or more specifically the drive end of the lathe. I'm using this little disc thingy here and mounting it to the shield, and then I'm going to, use the drive motor to spin it while I mark it, and then start to grind and sand on it. It'll make sense here in a second. By the way, this is not something that I would recommend doing because this could fly apart at any moment and cause great harm to me and my shop. In other words, folks, don't try this at home. I am a professional. No, that's a lie. I'm not a professional. I'm kind of an idiot, but you get the point. Just, if you want to do this, use extreme caution, please. Also, a little heads up for you. This will make just a gigantic mess. I mean, like a completely ridiculous amount of dust. Seriously, I feel like I was an extra on that movie Interstellar. You know what I mean? Anyone? Well, I know at least 3 of you do. Moving on, I got a little smarter and put up a tarp to kind of catch most of that dust instead of letting it get all over the place. That's what I hate about sawdust. It's coarse, rough, it gets everywhere. Anyway, once I got that part done, I unmounted it and then used my orbital sander to make the back all nice and smooth. Next, I made a crude-looking compass out of this paint stirring stick from Home Depot to mark a circle out on the middle of the shield. Then, I marked out some lines along the back to make it look like separate planks instead of one solid piece of plywood. To cut the grooves between these fake planks, I used this powered carver, which worked really well. Whoops! Never mind. I switched over to my tried and true wood carving chisels, which finished the job perfectly. Next, I got out the jigsaw to cut out the circle in the middle. Just a little word of caution here. If you're cutting a circle into something that's really thick like this material here, which is essentially about 1.25 inches thick, the problem lies in the fact that the jigsaw blade tends to drift a little bit with this thick of material. What you might want to do is cut a perfect circle into a different piece of material to act as a template. Then you could use the combination of the template and a flush trim router bit to accomplish a more perfect circle on your workpiece. Or maybe just get more practice not sucking with a jigsaw. The choice is yours, really. Next up, it's time to cut the handle for the shield. For mine, I'm cutting off a chunk of the handle from an old sledgehammer I had lying around. It's made of hickory, so it's plenty strong to hold the full weight of the shield. Plus,
there's nothing like a nice piece of hickory.
I marked and cut out some notches on both sides of the handle. I would have used my bandsaw for this, but it was out of commission at the moment, so I used my trusty old scroll saw, which did the job just fine. I used the disc sander to further thin down and smooth out all the surfaces on the handle. Once that I felt that was satisfactory, I held the handle in place on the shield and marked out a couple spots where I was going to notch out using some wood chisels. And then I, did that. It took a little bit of fine-tuning to get the notches deep enough for the handle to be set. But once I did, I applied some wood glue to both sides and then set the handle in place. In reality, I probably could have stopped right there, because I'm sure that the glue would be more than sufficient to keep the handle in place. But I drilled and countersunk a couple of holes and then put some screws in place on the sides. The reason that I offset the screws instead of installing them directly in the center is because I was going to install a couple of bolts going the whole way through the handle and the shield. But this would have been complete overkill. Next, I marked out the placement for the boss in the center of the shield, and began to spread around a ridiculous amount of wood filler. The main reason I was using this wood filler was to further build up the dome shape of the shield. Ideally, I should have been able to accomplish that using the angle grinder with the sanding disc on it. But after inspecting it more closely, I wasn't really happy with how shallow the dome was. So I opted instead to spread around 2 full tubs of wood filler in multiple thin layers. If I were to do this shield over again, I would make it completely out of MDF. And even though it would have been heavier, I would have had more consistent results on the dome. But it is what it is. Now, for the boss. I'm using this foam ball, or rather, this half of a foam ball. This thing has a diameter of 8 inches, but it's just a little bit too deep for what I'm wanting, so I used a saw to cut it off and make it a little bit shallower. Then, since I didn't really want it to be a perfect semicircle, I used some fire to melt it a little bit and then smush it into shape. Next, I had to hollow out the center, so I used the perfect tool that I could think of to accomplish such a feat. An ice cream scoop. I borrowed several different options from my wife, but I only ended up using this one because it works so well. Next, it was time to fix the boss into place, so I used a thick bead of weld-bond glue and then pushed it down onto the shield. And even though I didn't film it, I also set a sandbag on top of it and let it sit overnight just to make sure the foam didn't move. Then I slopped on another layer of the wood filler. For the next step, I marked out the placement of a bunch of banding little triangle spike thingies. And then using some clay, I made those little banding spike dealies. If you weren't able to tell, I'm not sure what those are called. But anyway, I made 4 of them, and then I set them on to make sure that they would fit, and I used some water to act as an adhesive to hold them into place. For a couple of them, I had to use a little bit of extra clay to act as a transition between the outer band and the triangle. The next step was to build up the boss in the middle, also using clay. I first applied a thick rope of it around the base of the boss dome, and then I applied a thin layer all over the dome itself. I tried to be as consistent as possible during this whole process. Once all the clay was on there, I used a wet rag to make everything nice and smooth. And then I got to work building up the banding around the boss itself. This involved multiple steps, with first putting down the base and then installing a little rope around the inner trim ring. Next, I needed to add some rivets around the banding. I just used little balls of clay and smushed them into place and used some water to make them stick. Now it was time to start on the most time-consuming part of this entire project, all the details around the boss. I had to make 7 little 8-pointed snowflake-looking star things, but I wanted them all to look consistent. So the way that I was going to accomplish this was to first make a master blank, get it all cut out and further refined. Then, once it was completely dry, I pushed more clay down on top of it to make a mold. Then, I very carefully peeled this mold off and baked this little cookie to make it nice and hard. While that was cooking, I went ahead and added some more detail to the shield. First, starting with the rivets on these little triangle things, and then moving on to the wings on the boss. To accomplish this, I cut the clay into some strips and then made the little pieces to put on the boss. I brushed on some water to once again act as an adhesive for these pieces. I got them all stuck on, and then, even though I didn't film it, I used a little carving chisel to further refine the shapes and lines. Now for the mold. I painted several coats of gloss paint onto it to make it non-stick. The only reason it's yellow is just because that's the first can that I grabbed. But anyway, I would say that the mold worked out great. Now all I had to do was cut it out using some chisels, and then pull away all of the waste clay. It took a little bit more of extra refinement, and then this little funky looking snowflake thing was ready to go. I marked out all the correct placements on the boss and then pushed the little star snowflake into place. I repeated that process until I had the 7 of them on there, and then I used a bit of water to make them stick. And for the 2 on the ends, I cut off 2 of the points. Once those were all dry, it was time to flip the shield over and work on the back. I used a pencil with a string compass to mark the outer band. I then flattened out some pieces of clay and spread some water on the wood, and on the clay itself, to adhere it into place. I then used a putty knife to trim away all of the excess on both the outer and inner edges of the banding. And I repeated this process until I completed the entire circumference of the shield. Once that was done, I installed all of the banding around the handle part. This was largely the same process, except I had to build up around the ends of the handle. I also had to spread some clay around on the inner edge of the wood and on the inside of the boss itself. Though I didn't really film all of that because it was a little bit difficult to get a good camera angle down inside the boss. Once that was all done, I added the triangle spikes to the banding on the back of the shield as well. And then I repeated the same process that I used for all the rivets. Next, once everything was dry, it was time to start painting. I started by applying a generous coat of gray primer on the front of the shield. Then I flipped around to the back, and I had a casualty. The spray can fell right out of the grip and landed directly on the tip. What sucks is that it was a brand new can. So I switched to black primer instead. I also taped the can to the grip, so I wouldn't repeat that same horrible accident. Next, I switched to a satin espresso spray paint to paint all the brown area. Then, after properly masking off everything, I started to apply some metallic silver over the appropriate areas. I went ahead and painted all the silver areas on both sides of the shield. Once all the silver paint was dry, I removed all of the masking from the shield, which was probably the most satisfying part of this project. The next step was to paint on all of the gold accents, which was pretty much the entire band of the boss. I suppose I could probably insert some joke about Bruce Springsteen here, but no. For all this gold, I'm using Tester's metallic gold paint. Once I got it spread around the band, I also added some detail to the rivets on the banding spikes. After the paint was all dry, I flipped the shield over and applied some brown shoe polish to the back. I probably could have used some wood stain for this, but I just kind of wanted to use shoe polish instead. And speaking of shoe polish, I added some black stuff to the handle. I also dabbed it on some rivets around the banding. I applied multiple coats and passes of the shoe polish mixture to all of the metal areas, until I got the desired effect of weathering that I was wanting. I did this around the inner boss and around the banding, making sure to leave some excess around all of the rivets. Once the back was complete, I flipped the shield over and applied some brown shoe polish all over the brown areas on the front. I also used a piece of very fine steel wool to work in the shoe polish and scuff it up a bit. Once that was done, I added the weathering to all the metal parts. I rubbed the shoe polish mixture in with my hands, and then wiped away all of the excess with a rag. And then this shield was complete. As far as custom prop replicas go that I've made, this was probably one of the more difficult ones, primarily because it was so time-consuming. I honestly had a few moments where I thought I would never get this thing done. All that said, I am thrilled with how it turned out. I think it'll be a beautiful addition to my collection, and is definitely worthy of the first Son of Gondor. Well, that project turned out to be just a little bit more difficult than I planned on. Seriously, this shield was kind of a pain in the butt. Having said that, I'm still pretty happy with the results. Believe me, it's far from perfect. There are blemishes and little imperfections all over it, but like I always say, that just adds to the character. I'll tell you one thing, this thing is pretty stinking heavy, but I think it looks really cool. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I do want to say real quick that I apologize for not getting an episode out last month. I had every intention of getting this shield done and getting the video out, but sometimes life just gets in the way. But hopefully that's the first and last time that this happens for this series, because I'm really excited to get all these props done. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please be sure to leave me a thumbs up down below. And go ahead and share it with somebody, because it only ever helps. And if you're new here, go ahead and check out some of my other stuff that's going to pop up right next to my head here in a moment. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Lord of the Rings: Artifacts of Arda.